Ayn Rand sampler. That's one of my most common materials that I get from the Ayn Rand Institute and other organizations. And I used to pass them out like toilet paper. Or tissue paper, whichever you prefer. Someone used the term toilet paper with me once. It stuck. I don't know why. I used to hand them out without any regard to who I was giving them to. I was not selective at all. I didn't try to vet them to try to see what kind of context they were coming from. And sure enough, it went absolutely nowhere. I went through boxes upon boxes of books. Or we can use the example of brochures if we're at a Tea Party rally, where we give out all of these things and find that no one is doing anything with them or about them.
We did it with the Constitution.
Yeah, it's weird. It's there to read, and all of our leaders swear to uphold it, and they don't.
Yeah.
And a lot of student groups pass out copies of the Constitution, and it turns out no one reads them. Because they're passing out copies of the Constitution with the attitude that we're doing this because we want you to agree with us. That's it. There's nothing more to their angle. It's just we want you to agree, which is true. But if that's all there is to it, then they're not going to accomplish anything. So what I started to do was I continued to give out books, but I only did it after I started to talk to people. So I'd be tabling, and people would come by, and maybe they would recognize Ayn Rand or whatever other book I was, or author I was passing out. So I had a basic conversation. And if they didn't, I would ask them, well, what do you study? And within about 15 seconds, because a lot of these people are on the way to class, I would be able to get a pretty basic idea of what their most basic value orientation is. Whether it's positive or negative. Whether they want to make more out of their lives or they want to be static. Whether they're moving in the right direction or the wrong direction. And if I didn't think much of them, I'm a pretty judgmental person, but in a rational way. If I didn't think much of them, I would politely turn them away. Convince them not to read these books. If I did think that there was some potential, and by potential I don't mean someone who calls himself an objectivist or a libertarian or a conservative, I just mean someone who has a positive outlook, who is open-minded, who wants to consider a different perspective that they're not getting from their professors. Then I would say, well, let me suggest this particular book for this reason. I would say, I think you should read this because it will help you achieve your dream of X. You're a pre-med student, well, I'd really like to see you be able to do as much as you want with that as possible. I don't think that anyone should be able to tell you how to do your job. I don't think anyone, whether it's your family or your government, should be able to restrict you. I want you to be able to pursue your own happiness as you see fit. And this book is about that. This is about people making the most out of their lives. And it turns out that that approach appeals to a lot more people than saying, well, this Obamacare is really terrible. And I started to see a difference. And the difference that I saw was that more people were coming by, more people were interested, more people who hadn't necessarily heard of these ideas were walking home with a copy of the book and a genuine interest in reading them. And the difference was that I put it in terms of their interests. I'm not a professional at it, but when I did that, it changed things immensely. My mailing list grew. I started to get more of a response from people. I saw a glow in their eyes that I had never seen before. And it was because I made them feel like valued individual human beings who had something to gain from reading a certain book or going to a certain event that I was promoting. Rather than just telling them, well, you're going to help me by being on my mailing list and making my mailing list look longer. So, in a nutshell, I basically showed them that their life belongs to them. Is that unclear what that means? That your life belongs to you?
Control our destinies. We have this. While we still.
Yes.
While we still can. That's what's right.
While we still can. Amen to that. We are obviously losing some control in some cases, ceding control because a lot of people are ignorant.
Common Core is an issue.
That is a
Getting
great
to the
issue.
children.
I'll mention it briefly, but in a different context than what you're probably getting at. So yes, we control our own destinies. Whether we are rich or poor, or gay or straight, or native or foreign, we all control our own destinies. And that's the most basic message that resonates with people, is when you remind them that their life belongs to them. And that is more basic and more approachable and more digestible than saying, well, we really don't like what's going on right now. We're anti-this, anti-that, anti-this other thing. We don't like Obama, so we'd really like to get rid of him. I mean, I agree with you, but that's not my message anymore. Because that makes people feel like they're at fault. If they voted for him, they're like, oh, well, you're criticizing me. If they like how he talks, then you're offending a nice guy that they'd like to go get a drink with. But if you're able to convince them that it's in their interest, and that a certain set of policies, regardless of what politician or figurehead is promoting them, is harmful to them, then that is more effective. And granted, I don't deal as much with policy as I do with the political philosophy behind it. So I have to get people thinking, what does freedom mean to you? And I'm going to share a good quote with you from Rand Paul, actually, if I can find it. Yeah. So Rand Paul had a great little article in the Intercollegiate Review recently, and it was a message to students. And he was saying how it's important that we don't get so caught up in just being negative and showing where other policies fail, when we could spend more time showing the promise of our own ideas. And he said, very simply, more freedom and less government means more jobs, more wealth, and a better life for everyone.
There's somebody on the right, not an objectivist, but somebody on the right who deals with some of this, and his arguments are along the lines of what is the real source of happiness. And essentially, among many other very basic things I could mention, the essential element is self-fulfillment, but that can sound a little wishy-washy. The things that you have, you know you've earned. Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute,
Yep.
who's written about 2 or 3 relatively short books in the last few years on these very subjects. That's all. I'm just putting a plug in.
No, I appreciate it, because what we can take from what you just said is that different people define happiness in different ways. Now, I think that there is an objective basis for happiness, and that there's a certain way that we can pursue it, and that a lot of people who have the freedom to do it the wrong way, do it the wrong way. There are a lot of people out there who do a lot of things that I look down on, but I think that they have the right to do it because it's not harming me. And I have a very different definition of happiness and the pursuit of happiness than they do. But if we are the vanguard of the founding principles of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if we believe that those are paramount, then we have to extend that to everybody. You can't say that we believe in the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for some people some of the time. We have to say this applies to everybody, everywhere, all the time. That's the only way that America can lead the world intellectually, is by staying true to those principles. And being able to welcome other views so long as they don't hinder my own life. You know, I don't smoke, but I think other people should smoke. One of the basic examples I like to go back to, if they like to. So my experiences and what I learned and what started to work for me, I think that we can apply to the Tea Party. Because if we place a premium on being objective and rational and maximizing personal liberty and living in a kind of system that respects that, and we want to stay relevant and long term, then there are certain things that we have to do that we're not already doing that well. And I have a few points, but they're all going to tie into one thing, and one of them is to solve the image problem, because a lot of people see the Tea Party as just a bunch of radicals, which is true. I think of myself as very radical, but it's about how we present ourselves. Another thing is that...
Once upon a time, this word radical was a compliment.
Constitutionalists be really called a radical.
Radical for our time, perhaps.
Yeah, well, that's
Well,
a good...
because of the other entity, that whole
Yeah.
liberal, actually the invaders.
Yeah, yeah.
I think a lot of us probably originally pre-Obama would consider ourselves center-right, because the left has become more and more progressive and radical left. We find ourselves dragged, well, not even dragged, but equal and opposite
Polarized.
polarization that occurs is suddenly, even though in a normal spectrum we would be kind of center-right, suddenly we find ourselves categorized as more radical. I don't think we are at all. I mean, honestly, I don't care what the next guy does.
But I'm curious...
Well, it's easy to challenge the rationale of the labels that people give to the Tea Party, but my point...
I'm curious of this word as an epithet.
And you can add after. My point is that the way the Tea Party is perceived is as a disconnected body that doesn't get people except people in the Tea Party, that doesn't relate with the average person. I think these things are wrong, by the way. I'm saying what a lot of people, yes, the public perception. And the reason for that is that we're not putting it in terms of, well, I shouldn't speak for everyone because this is sometimes wrong, but that a lot of times the Tea Party doesn't put its values in terms of the interests of the people that we're supposedly trying to advance.
Popular culture.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. So when the message is focused on the negatives, when it's focused on challenging Obama, on challenging Obamacare, on being anti-this, anti-that, anti-Common Core, and a bunch of other things, then people get turned off to it because they don't like negativity. But when the message is not that we're anti-Obama, but we're pro being able to control our own destinies, that we want to be able to choose the healthcare plan that we want and keep it afterwards. Or in the case of Common Core, you mentioned Common Core, I think. A very common argument against Common Core, which I agree with, is that it gives too much federal power over education. Right.
Shaping also.
Well, the average
Yes.
person doesn't care about that.
Right, the average person doesn't care because they're not going to be turned on to an issue if it's just put in terms of negatives. No one is going to get on board and try to challenge Common Core.
I think the average person doesn't know about Common Core. Not just
Well, the average person doesn't care about federalism either. It's an abstract concept.
When it comes to Common Core, it's very simple.
What he's trying to make, though, is that
Who you have to...
you simply present the message of its freedom that you're talking about,
Right. Yeah.
that you break it down. And
People
you
don't
say,
appreciate freedom.
Well, that's...
Parents...
If-
Parents appreciate
Negative.
their ability to shape what is good for their children.
Yes. Yeah.
Nobody is particularly interested in Common Core unless you are a parent anyway.
How does it affect them and how does it benefit them?
I think Nathan's
Exactly.
point here is that even for those who don't know what Common Core is, if you approach them about the issue in a fear-mongering way, they're not going to listen to you. When you say, we like freedom, some things restrict freedom, but we want to talk to you about free choice in schools and etc.,
Right.
they can then take that message and relate it to Common Core on their own eventually.
And what,
Yes.
and what often happens with arguments is they'll say, well, you're against Obamacare, what's your solution? And that is an immediate, like, turns it back on you, and if you haven't presented a positive message as he's suggesting, then you're trapped, and you're having to backpedal, you're having to sound defensive.
Well, you also accept their premise of Obamacare as the status quo.
Well,
It turns it from,
right.
like, why is Obamacare a good thing, is to, like, well, what's your alternative? But
Well, you can point to the
Anyways.
solutions that are going on. Well,
That's a whole nother
All of this is
conversation.
exactly right, and it does demonstrate the principle that I was trying to convey. And it's that whatever policy you're challenging, whether it's Common Core or the National Defense Authorization Act or the Affordable Care Act or whatever else, if the only basis that we ever challenge it on is just, well, this is Obama's fault, or if we only look at the economics of it, which I think is a better approach, then it's not going to excite people. It's not going to get them interested. Whereas if we can show people, well, you're going to lose control over your own kid's education. You're not going to be able to decide where your kid goes to school. You're not going to be able to participate in the parent-teacher association meetings, things like that. When people see that they are ceding control over their own lives and that they will be directly affected by these things, then they start to think about it.